The heat shimmered off the cracked earth like ghosts rising from the ground, and Yates Sullivan thought he was seeing things when he spotted the woman clawing at the dirt with her bare hands 3 miles outside Montrose, Colorado. It was August 1883, and the summer had been merciless, turning the green of spring into a landscape of dust and desperation. He pulled his horse to a stop, squinting through the afternoon glare at the figure kneeling in what looked like a shallow depression, her dress stained brown with dirt and sweat, her hands moving with a frantic determination that spoke of either madness or absolute necessity. Yates had been riding fence lines for the Garrison Ranch for the better part of 6 years, ever since he'd drifted into the western slope of Colorado with nothing but his saddle and a reputation for hard work. At 26, he'd seen plenty of strange things in this unforgiving country, but a woman digging a well with her bare hands ranked among the most peculiar. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass, and approached with the caution of a man who'd learned that desperation made people unpredictable. "Madam," he called out, keeping his distance, "what are you doing out here?" The woman's head snapped up, and he found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, fierce and bright, in a face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with dark hair escaping from a braid that hung over one shoulder. Her hands were bleeding, he noticed, the nails broken and the palms scraped raw. "What does it look like I'm doing?" she shot back, her voice hoarse but defiant. "I'm digging a well." Yates glanced at the hole she'd managed to excavate. It was maybe 2 feet deep and 3 feet across, barely a dent in the earth that would need to go down at least 20 feet to have any hope of reaching water. "With your bare hands?" "My shovel broke," she said flatly, turning back to her work. "And I don't have another one." He studied the homestead behind her, a small cabin that looked like it had been thrown together with more hope than skill, a sagging roof and walls that wouldn't hold up to the first hard winter. There was a small corral with no animals in it, a vegetable garden that had given up the fight against the drought, and no sign of anyone else around. The nearest neighbor was probably 5 miles away, and Montrose itself was a good 3-hour ride, depending on how fast you pushed your horse. "You out here alone?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "That's none of your concern," she said, but the way her shoulders tensed told him everything. She was alone, and she was scared, though she'd die before admitting it. Yates walked back to his horse and untied the shovel that hung from his saddle, the one he used for clearing irrigation ditches and dealing with problems along the fence line. He'd learned long ago to carry tools because, in this country, you never knew what you'd need. He returned to the shallow hole and stepped down into it, the shovel ringing against a rock as he drove it into the earth. The woman stared at him, her mouth opening in surprise. "What are you doing?" "Helping you dig," Yates said, scooping out a load of rocky soil and tossing it to the side. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." For a long moment she just watched him work, her hands falling still against the dirt. Then she said quietly, "Why?" It was a fair question. He could have ridden on, minded his own business, let her figure out her own problems. That's what most people would have done. But Yates had been raised by a mother who'd taken in strays and helped neighbors without question, back in Missouri before the war had torn everything apart. He'd lost her when he was 15, lost everything really, but some lessons stuck with you no matter how far you drifted. "Because you need it," he said simply. "And because nobody should be out here alone trying to dig a well with their bare hands." She blinked, and he thought he saw the shine of tears before she looked away. "My name is Vera Owens," she said after a moment. "This is my land, my homestead." "Yates Sullivan," he replied, driving the shovel down again. "I work for the Garrison Ranch, about 8 miles southeast of here." "I know the Garrison Ranch," Vera said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "They tried to buy this land from me last month, offered me half what it's worth." That didn't surprise Yates. The Garrison family had a reputation for expanding their holdings, and they weren't always particular about how they did it. He was just hired help, though, not involved in the business side of things, and he made sure she knew that. "I just fix fences and move cattle," he told her. "The land deals are above my pay grade." Vera seemed to relax a fraction. She pulled herself out of the hole and sat on the edge, her legs dangling down. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have snapped. It's just been a difficult few months." "No apology needed," Yates said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his forehead. The sun was brutal, beating down on them without mercy, and he could feel his shirt sticking to his back. "How long have you been out here?" "Since April," she said. "My father and I filed the claim together. He died in June. Fever took him." The words were flat, delivered without emotion, but Yates heard the pain underneath them. Losing family was never easy, and losing them out here, isolated and far from help, had to be even worse. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, meaning it. "Thank you." Vera looked toward the cabin, then back at the hole. He was going to dig the well. He'd ordered proper equipment, good tools, but then he got sick and everything fell apart. The money ran out. I sent for the equipment anyway, but they said they couldn't deliver until I paid in full. So here I am. Yates could see the whole sorry picture now. A young woman alone on a homestead claim, no money, no resources, trying to survive in country that killed experienced ranchers. The fact that she was still here, still fighting, spoke to a stubbornness that bordered on foolhardy, but it also spoke to courage, and he respected that. "Well," he said, "we're not going to hit water today, but we can make a good start. You have any food in that cabin?" "Water?" "Some," Vera admitted. "I've been rationing." "Then let's work until sundown, and we'll see how far we get." They fell into a rhythm after that, Yates digging while Vera hauled the dirt away in a wooden bucket she'd brought from the cabin. It was hard, monotonous work, made harder by the heat and the rocky soil. They didn't talk much, both of them saving their energy for the labor, but there was something almost companionable about the shared effort. Yates found himself glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the determined set of her jaw, the way she refused to quit even though exhaustion was written in every line of her body. When the sun finally touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they'd managed to get the hole down to nearly 5 feet. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of what they needed, but it was progress. Yates climbed out of the hole, his muscles aching, and found Vera sitting on the ground with her back against a rock, her eyes closed. "You all right?" he asked, concern threading through his voice. "Just tired," she said without opening her eyes. "Thank you for your help today. I don't know how to repay you." "Don't need repayment," Yates said, "but I will need to head back before it gets full dark. I'm expected at the ranch." Vera's eyes opened, and he saw fear flicker across her face before she hid it. The thought of being alone again clearly scared her, even if she wouldn't say it. Yates made a decision in that moment, one he hoped he wouldn't regret. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, "if you want the help. It's my day off, and I don't have anything else planned." "You'd do that?" The disbelief in her voice made something in his chest tighten. "Said I would, didn't I?" He walked to his horse and swung into the saddle, looking down at her. "Get some rest tonight. We've got a lot of digging ahead of us." As he rode away, Yates glanced back once and saw her still sitting there, watching him go. Something had shifted in the space of those few hours, something he couldn't quite name. All he knew was that he'd be back in the morning, just like he'd promised. True to his word, Yates arrived at Vera's homestead just after sunrise the next day, bringing with him a second shovel he'd borrowed from the ranch's equipment shed and a canteen full of fresh water. Vera was already up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, and she'd set out a small breakfast of hardtack and coffee so weak it was barely brown. They ate quickly, not wasting time on conversation, and then they were in the hole again, digging. The second day was harder than the first. The deeper they went, the more rocks they encountered, some of them too big to lift, and requiring careful work to break apart with a pickaxe Vera had found rusting in a shed. Yates's hands blistered, despite the calluses he'd built up from years of ranch work. and he saw Vera wrapping her own hands in strips of cloth torn from an old dress, trying to protect the wounds that had opened up the day before. "You don't have to keep digging," he told her during a break, both of them sitting in the shade of the cabin. "You could let me handle this." "It's my well," Vera said stubbornly. "My land. I won't sit back and watch while someone else does the work. Even if it tears your hands apart." "Even then!" Yates shook his head, but he was secretly impressed. Most people he knew would have given up by now, would have sold the land to the garrisons, or packed up and headed back to wherever they'd come from. Vera had something fierce in her, a refusal to bend that reminded him of the pinyon pines that grew twisted and gnarled on the mountainsides, shaped by wind and weather, but never broken. "Where'd you come from originally?" he asked, more to pass the time than anything else. "Kansas," Vera said. "Small town called Ellsworth. My father was a clerk in a dry goods store, but he always wanted his own land. When I turned 21 last year, we decided to try our luck out here. The Homestead Act gave us a chance we never would have had back home. It's hard country," Yates said carefully, "even for people who know what they're doing." "I'm learning," Vera replied. "I learn fast." Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Yates would arrive early, they'd dig until the heat became unbearable, rest during the worst of the afternoon, and then work until dark. He started bringing supplies from town, things he bought with his own wages, better food, medical supplies for their hands, rope that would be useful for hauling buckets once they hit water. Vera protested at first, pride making her stiff and resistant, but Yates wore her down with gentle insistence. "Consider it an investment," he told her. "Once you've got water, you'll be able to grow crops again, maybe run some livestock. You can pay me back then if it makes you feel better." "I will pay you back," Vera said firmly. "Every penny." They talked more as the days passed, sharing stories during their breaks, and in the evenings when the work was done. Yates told her about growing up in Missouri, about his mother's kindness and his father's stern discipline, about the way the war had shattered his family and left him adrift. He joined up at 14, lying about his age, and spent a year in hell before the whole thing ended. After that, there'd been nothing to go back to, so he'd drifted west, like so many others, looking for a fresh start. Vera shared her own history more slowly, revealing pieces of herself like someone showing treasured possessions. She'd been engaged once, back in Kansas, to a banker's son who'd seemed solid and dependable. But when her father had announced their plans to homestead in Colorado, her fiancé had issued an ultimatum: stay with him, or lose him forever. She'd chosen her father, and she'd never regretted it, even if the loneliness sometimes threatened to swallow her whole. "He wanted me to be something I wasn't," she explained one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the stars come out. "Quiet, obedient, content to sit in a parlor and pour tea for the rest of my life. That's not who I am." "Who are you then?" Yates asked, genuinely curious. Vera was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Someone who wants more," she finally said. "Someone who isn't afraid of hard work or risk. Someone who believes that women can do more than just wait for men to make decisions for them." "That's dangerous talk in some circles," Yates observed, though there was no judgment in his voice. "I know," Vera said with a small smile. "But out here, there's no one to tell me I'm wrong. Out here, I can be whoever I want to be." Yates found himself drawn to her philosophy, to the fierce independence that radiated from her despite her circumstances. He'd never met a woman quite like Vera Owens, and somewhere in the course of those long days digging side by side, his feelings had started to shift from simple respect to something more complicated and intense. 2 weeks after he'd first found her digging in the dirt, they hit water. It happened just after noon on a Saturday, the shovel breaking through into a layer of sand that came up wet and dark. Vera, who'd been hauling dirt at the time, dropped her bucket and scrambled to the edge of the hole, peering down at Yates with wide eyes. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked breathlessly. "Water," Yates confirmed, unable to keep the grin off his face. "We've got water." Vera let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the empty landscape, and before Yates could climb out of the hole, she jumped down beside him, laughing and crying at the same time. They stood there in the tight space, covered in mud and sweat, and suddenly Yates was very aware of how close she was, of the way her eyes shone with happiness, of the curve of her mouth as she smiled up at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you. I would have died out here trying." "You would have figured something out," Yates said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You're too stubborn to give up." "Maybe," Vera agreed, "but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Yates didn't quite dare name. Then Vera reached up and hugged him, a quick, fierce embrace that left him stunned. Before he could respond, she'd pulled away and was climbing out of the hole, already talking about what they needed to do next to properly line the well and build a pump system. Over the following weeks, Yates found reasons to keep coming back. The well needed to be properly finished, stone-lined to prevent collapse, and a windmill ordered from a catalog would need to be installed once it arrived. He taught Vera how to maintain the water source, how to prevent contamination, how to build a simple pump system using materials they could scavenge or buy cheap in Montrose. He also helped her repair the cabin's roof, shore up the corral, and plant a late-season garden that might produce something before the first frost. The people at the Garrison Ranch started to notice his absences on his days off, started making comments about where he was spending his time. Yates ignored most of it, but when the ranch foreman pulled him aside one afternoon and suggested he stop wasting his time on a failing homestead, something inside him snapped. "Miss Owens's homestead isn't failing," he said, keeping his voice level with effort. "She's making improvements every day, and her claim is legitimate. She's got water now, and she'll make it work." "The Garrisons want that land," the foreman said bluntly. "They're going to make her an offer she can't refuse, and when they do, you don't want to be caught in the middle of it." "That's Miss Owens's decision to make," Yates replied. "Not mine and not the Garrisons'." The foreman shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Sullivan. Don't say I didn't warn you." Yates thought about that conversation as he rode out to Vera's place the next day. He'd been working for the Garrison Ranch for 6 years, loyal and hardworking, never causing trouble, but the idea of them pressuring Vera, of trying to force her off her land, made his blood boil. He'd seen too many small homesteaders pushed out by bigger operations, seen too much injustice dressed up as business. When he arrived at the homestead, he found Vera in her garden, pulling weeds with the same determined energy she brought to everything. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and smiled in a way that made his heart do something complicated in his chest. "You're late today," she called out. "I was starting to worry." "Got held up at the ranch," Yates said, dismounting. "Needed to have a conversation with the foreman." Something in his tone made Vera straighten up, her smile fading. "What kind of conversation?" He told her, not sugarcoating it, about the Garrison's continued interest in her land and the foreman's warning. Vera's face went through a series of expressions: anger, fear, determination, before settling on a kind of weary resignation. "I knew this would happen eventually," she said. "They've been circling like vultures since my father died. Every time I go into Montrose, someone makes a comment about how hard it must be for a woman alone, how much easier it would be to just sell and move somewhere civilized." "What do you want to do?" Yates asked. "Stay," Vera said immediately. "This is my land, bought and paid for with my father's savings and proven up with my own sweat. I'm not leaving." "Then you won't have to," Yates said. "I'll help you however I can." Vera studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why are you doing all this? You barely know me, and yet you've spent weeks helping me, bringing me supplies, fixing up my homestead. What do you want from me, Yates?" It was the question he'd been asking himself for days now, and he finally had to confront the answer. He wanted her. Not in the way men usually wanted women, though there was certainly attraction there, simmering beneath everything else, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. He wanted to be part of her life, to stand beside her as she built something from nothing, to share in both the struggles and the triumphs. He wanted to wake up on this land and see her face first thing in the morning, to fall asleep knowing she was safe. I want to court you, he said simply, if you'll have me. Vera's eyes widened, genuine surprise crossing her face. Court me? Yes, madam, Yates said, holding her gaze. I know I'm just a ranch hand with no land of my own, and you're an independent woman with your own homestead. I know I've got nothing to offer you that you don't already have or can't get for yourself. But I care about you, Vera. I have for a while now, and I'd like the chance to see if maybe you might care about me too. The silence that followed felt endless. Yates forced himself to stay still, to let her think, even though every instinct screamed at him to fill the quiet with more words, more explanations. Finally, Vera spoke. I do care about you, she said quietly. That's what scares me. Why does it scare you? Because caring about people means you can lose them, Vera said, and he heard the pain of her father's death in every word. Because depending on someone means they have power over you. Because I've spent the last few months proving to myself that I can survive alone, and now you're asking me to risk that independence. I'm not asking you to give up anything, Yates said, taking a step closer. I'm asking if I can be part of what you're building here. Your partner, not your keeper. Your choice, not your obligation. Vera's eyes searched his face, looking for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. All right, she said. Yes, you can court me, Yates Sullivan. But I warn you, I'm not easy to be with. I'm stubborn and independent, and I don't always do what I'm told. I know, Yates said, and he was smiling now, relief and joy flooding through him. That's what I like about you. They stood there in the garden with the sun beating down and the mountains rising in the distance, and Yates thought this moment might be one he'd remember for the rest of his life. Then Vera stepped forward and took his hand, her fingers calloused and scarred from work, fitting against his own work-roughened palm like they'd been made for it. The courting that followed was unlike anything Yates had experienced before. With Vera, there were no fancy dances or restaurant dinners, no performances of conventional romance. Instead, they worked together on the homestead, building something tangible and real. Yates showed her how to break a horse to saddle, and Vera taught him how to preserve vegetables for the winter. They argued about the best way to construct a chicken coop and laughed together when their first attempt collapsed in a windstorm. Yates started spending more nights at the homestead, sleeping in the barn to preserve propriety, but always nearby in case Vera needed anything. He brought his own provisions so as not to be a burden, and gradually his possessions migrated from his sparse room at the ranch bunkhouse to the homestead that was starting to feel like home. The Garrisons made their move in September. Yates was out checking the cattle on the northern range when the foreman found him and told him to report back to the main house. When he arrived, he found the ranch owner, Carlton Garrison, waiting for him on the porch along with his son Marcus and a lawyer from Montrose. Sullivan, Carlton said without preamble, we need to discuss your involvement with the Owens woman. Miss Owens, Yates corrected automatically. And there's nothing to discuss. My personal life is my own business. Not when it conflicts with ranch interests, Marcus Garrison cut in. He was a few years younger than Yates, pampered and arrogant, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to work for anything. We've made Miss Owens several generous offers for her land, and each time she's refused. We have reason to believe you're influencing her decision. Miss Owens makes her own decisions, Yates said coldly. And maybe if you offered her a fair price instead of trying to cheat her, she'd consider selling. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles, spoke up. Mr. Sullivan, you should be aware that interfering with legitimate business negotiations could have consequences for your employment here. Yates had known this was coming, had known from the moment he decided to help Vera that it might cost him his job. but hearing it stated so bluntly still sent a flash of anger through him. Are you firing me? He asked Carlton directly. The ranch owner had the grace to look uncomfortable. I don't want to fire you, Sullivan. You're a good worker, reliable, but I need to know where your loyalties lie, with this ranch or with that homesteader. It wasn't really a choice, not anymore. Yates had made his decision weeks ago, maybe even that first day when he'd seen Vera digging in the dirt with her bare hands and recognized something kindred in her stubborn refusal to quit. My loyalty is to people who treat others fairly, he said, and to a woman who's got more courage in her little finger than most men I've known. If that means I can't work here anymore, then I guess that's how it is. Carlton sighed. Clean out your bunk and be off the property by sundown. I'll have your wages waiting at the main house. Yates nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked away. He felt strangely light as he gathered his few belongings from the bunkhouse, ignoring the curious stares of the other ranch hands. He'd spent 6 years building a life here, and he was walking away from it without looking back. But when he thought about Vera, about the future they might build together, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. He rode directly to the homestead, arriving as the sun was setting. Vera was outside, hanging laundry on a line they'd strung between two posts, and she turned when she heard his horse. Her smile faded when she saw his face. What happened? She asked, coming toward him. Yates dismounted and told her everything. Vera listened in silence, her expression growing harder with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, she finally said. You lost your job because of me. I lost my job because I chose to stand up for what's right, Yates corrected. That's not the same thing. Still, Vera wrapped her arms around herself, looking troubled. What will you do now? Where will you go? This was the moment of truth, Yates realized. The moment where he either retreated or committed fully to the path he'd chosen. He thought about his mother, about the values she'd tried to instill in him before the world had torn her away. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be and the kind of life he wanted to live. I was hoping I could stay here, he said. Help you work this land, build up the homestead. I've got some savings, enough to buy supplies to get us through the winter. And come spring, we could file for my own homestead claim on the adjoining land if it's available. We'd have twice as much acreage, better chance of making something sustainable. You want to stay here? Vera repeated slowly, as if testing the words. With me. If you'll have me, Yates said. I know it's not conventional, a man and woman living on the same property without being married. I know what people will say, but I also know that I don't want to be anywhere else. Vera looked at him for a long time, and he saw something shift behind her eyes. Then marry me, she said. Yates blinked. What? Marry me, Vera repeated, and now she was smiling, that fierce, beautiful smile that transformed her whole face. You're right that people will talk if we're living here together unwed, and you're right that we could file for more land if we're married, combine our holdings into something stronger. But mostly, I'm asking because I love you. Yates Sullivan. I think I have, since the day you jumped into that hole and started digging beside me without asking for anything in return. Joy burst through Yates like a sunrise, bright and overwhelming. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled Vera into his arms, kissing her with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for a moment the whole world narrowed down to just the two of them and the promise of a future they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. Yes, he said. Yes, I'll marry you. Tomorrow, if you want. Let's make it next week, Vera said, laughing a little. Give me time to make a decent dress and ride into Montrose to arrange things with the minister. I want to do this properly. They were married the following Saturday in the small church in Montrose, with a handful of witnesses pulled in from the street, and a minister who looked bemused by the whole affair. Vera wore a simple dress of blue calico that she'd sewn herself, and Yates had borrowed a suit coat from the general store owner, who'd taken pity on them. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, but when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Yates kissed his bride, he felt like the richest man in Colorado. The winter that followed was hard, as all winters were in that country, but they faced it together. Yates filed a homestead claim on the quarter section adjacent to Vera's property, and they started making improvements to both pieces of land. They built a better barn, added onto the cabin to make more room, and planned for the livestock they'd purchase come spring. The Garrisons made one more attempt to buy them out in November, sending Marcus and the lawyer with an offer that was marginally better than before, but still insulting. Yates and Vera stood side by side on their porch and politely but firmly declined. After that, the Garrisons seemed to accept that they weren't going anywhere. Life settled into a rhythm that felt right in a way Yates had never experienced before. He woke up each morning next to his wife, worked hard all day on land that belonged to them, and fell asleep exhausted but satisfied. Vera bloomed in their partnership, her natural competence and determination finding an outlet in everything from managing their finances to learning how to shoot straight enough to bring down game for their table. Yates found himself constantly amazed by her, by the depth of her strength and the quickness of her mind. They weren't always in perfect harmony. They argued about money and priorities, about whether to invest in cattle or focus on crops, about 100 small decisions that made up the business of survival. But they always worked through it, learning how to compromise and listen, building a foundation of trust that went deeper than romance. One evening in February, snowbound and cozy in their cabin with a fire crackling in the hearth, Vera looked up from the ledger where she was recording their expenses. "We're going to make it," she said with quiet wonder. "We're actually going to make it." Yates looked around at the cabin they'd improved together, at the shelves stocked with food they'd preserved, at the plans spread out on the table for spring planting. "Never doubted it for a minute," he lied cheerfully. Vera laughed, the sound warm and bright. "Liar, I've seen you pacing at night, worrying about every little thing." "Maybe a little doubt," Yates admitted, "but mostly faith. In you, in us, in what we're building here." "Come here," Vera said, setting aside the ledger and holding out her hand. When Yates joined her, she pulled him down onto the small sofa they'd built together from salvaged lumber. "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in her tone made Yates's heart skip. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Vera said simply. "About 3 months along, I think." I wanted to be sure before I said anything. For a moment, Yates couldn't speak. A baby. Their baby. The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. "Are you all right?" he finally managed. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Vera assured him, laughing at his panic. "Women have been having babies for quite some time now. I'm healthy, we've got food and shelter, and by the time the baby comes in late summer, we'll be even better established." Yates pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he repeated, testing the words. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Vera confirmed. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "Terrified, excited, completely overwhelmed. But happy, yes. So happy." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. They brought in a woman from Montrose, a midwife named Mrs. Chin, who'd come from California and knew her business, to check on Vera regularly and to be present when the time came. Yates found himself getting anxious about every little thing, fussing over Vera until she finally told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. "I'm pregnant. Not dying," she said with exasperation. "I can still work, still do my share. The baby and I are both fine." But Yates couldn't help worrying, couldn't help thinking about all the things that could go wrong. He'd lost his mother young, had seen too much death in his life, and the thought of losing Vera or their child terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. She seemed to understand, though, tolerating his hovering with mostly good humor and occasionally telling him to go find something useful to do when he got too overbearing. In late July, with the homestead flourishing and their future looking brighter than Yates had dared to hope, the baby came. The labor lasted through a long night and into the morning, with Mrs. Chen calmly directing Yates to boil water and gather supplies, while Vera worked through the contractions with gritted teeth and impressive fortitude. Yates felt useless, standing by and watching his wife in pain, but Mrs. Chen assured him his presence was important. "She needs to know you're here," the midwife said. "That's more valuable than you think." Finally, as the sun was climbing toward noon, Yates heard the thin, outraged cry of a newborn. Mrs. Chen emerged from the bedroom smiling, a small bundle wrapped in a clean blanket. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy. And your wife did beautifully. She's tired, but fine." Yates took his son with trembling hands, staring down at the red, wrinkled face with a sense of awe that bordered on religious. This was his child, his and Vera's, a whole new person that they'd brought into the world together. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, his tiny fists waving, and Yates felt his heart crack open in ways he hadn't known were possible. Mrs. Chen let him have a moment, then gently took the baby back. "Let me clean him up properly, and then you can take him in to meet his mother." Vera was propped up against the pillows when Yates entered, looking exhausted but radiant. Her hair was damp with sweat, her face pale, but she was smiling as Mrs. Chen placed the baby in her arms. "Look at him," she said softly. "Look at what we made." Yates sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Vera, the other hand gently touching his son's downy head. "He's perfect," he said hoarsely. "You're perfect, thank you." "For what?" Vera asked, looking up at him. "For taking a chance on a ranch hand with nothing to offer," Yates said. "For building this life with me. For giving me a family. We gave each other that," Vera corrected gently. "This is ours, Yates. All of it." They named their son Thomas after Vera's father, with James as a middle name for Yates's grandfather. Young Thomas proved to be a healthy, hungry baby with a strong set of lungs, and the homestead adjusted to the rhythm of infant care. Yates found himself walking the floor at night, bouncing his son and singing half-remembered lullabies from his own childhood, while Vera slept in exhausted bursts between feedings. The days were full and challenging, juggling the work of the homestead with the demands of a newborn, but they managed. Neighbors started stopping by more frequently now that Yates and Vera had proven they were there to stay. Some offered help and advice. Others just wanted to see the baby, but gradually they became part of the wider community around Montrose. The isolation that had nearly broken Vera in those first months alone was replaced by a network of people who might not be close friends, but were at least friendly. The Garrisons left them alone, having apparently accepted that the Sullivans weren't going anywhere. Yates heard through the grapevine that Carlton Garrison had moved on to trying to buy out other, less stubborn homesteaders, and he felt a pang of sympathy for whoever ended up in that crosshairs. But it wasn't his problem anymore. His life was here, with Vera and Thomas, on land that belonged to them. 2 years after Thomas's birth, they had another child, a daughter they named Caroline. She came easier than her brother, quick and decisive like her mother, with a full head of dark hair and Vera's storm cloud eyes. Thomas, who just turned 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly until Yates or Vera gently redirected his enthusiastic affection. The homestead continued to grow and prosper. They'd built up a small herd of cattle, had chickens and pigs, grew vegetables and some wheat. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was a sustainable living, the kind of security that had seemed impossible back when Yates had first found Vera digging in the dirt. They'd added 2 more rooms to the cabin, making it a proper house, and built a second barn for equipment and hay storage. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work was done, Yates and Vera would sit on the porch they'd built together and watch the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked about their plans for the future, about expanding their holdings or starting a small orchard. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, content with what they'd achieved. Do you ever regret it? Vera asked one such evening, her head resting on Yates's shoulder. Giving up your job at the ranch, throwing your lot in with me when you barely knew me? Never, Yates said immediately. Not once. This is the life I was meant to have. You're the person I was meant to find. I think about that day sometimes, Vera said, when you rode up and found me trying to dig that well. I was so desperate, so scared, but I couldn't admit it even to myself. And then you just stepped into that hole and started helping, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was the most natural thing in the world, Yates said. You needed help and I could provide it. Everything else just followed from there. Everything else, Vera repeated with a soft laugh. Marriage, children, a whole life together. That's a lot to follow from one decision to help a stranger. Best decision I ever made, Yates said, kissing the top of her head. The years continued to roll by, marked by the rhythms of farming and family. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who loved the animals and showed promise with horses. Caroline was quieter, but just as determined as her mother, with a mind that was quick and curious. They had a third child when Thomas was 6 and Caroline was 4, another son they named Peter. He was the calmest of their children, content to observe and think before acting, and Yates saw echoes of himself in the boy's careful nature. The homestead became known throughout the area as the Sullivan place, a symbol of what hard work and persistence could achieve. Other homesteaders came to them for advice, and Yates and Vera were always willing to share what they'd learned. They never forgot how hard those early days had been, how close Vera had come to losing everything, and they tried to help others avoid the same pitfalls. The well that they dug together, that first well that had brought them together and saved the homestead, continued to provide clean, cold water year after year. Yates maintained it carefully, making sure the stone lining stayed intact and the windmill pump kept working. Sometimes, when he was working on it, he'd remember that first day, the sight of Vera on her knees in the dirt, her hands bloody and her face set with determination. He'd think about how far they'd come and feel a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. Vera thrived in their life together, her natural strength finding full expression in the running of the homestead and the raising of their children. She kept their books meticulously, negotiated hard with buyers in Montrose, and managed to turn their small operation into something genuinely profitable. But she never lost the fierce independence that had defined her, never became the kind of wife who deferred to her husband on every decision. They were true partners, sometimes agreeing and sometimes arguing, but always working toward the same goals. As the children grew older, Yates made sure they knew the story of how their parents had met. He wanted them to understand the values that had brought their family into being hard work, mutual respect, the willingness to help others without expecting reward. Thomas and Caroline and Peter listened to the tale of the well with rapt attention, making their father tell it over and over until they had every detail memorized. "Mama was digging with her bare hands?" Caroline would ask, her eyes wide. "With her bare hands," Yates would confirm, "because she needed water and she wasn't going to let anything stop her." "And you just helped her?" Thomas would chime in. "Even though you didn't know her?" "That's right," Yates would say, "because it was the right thing to do." When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to file for his own homestead claim on land adjacent to theirs. Yates felt a mixture of pride and sadness at this declaration of independence, but Vera was purely pleased. "He's ready," she said to Yates in private. "We raised him to be strong and capable. Now we have to let him prove it." They helped Thomas establish his claim, lending him equipment and advice, but letting him do the bulk of the work himself. It was important that he build something with his own hands, just as Yates and Vera had done. Caroline, who was 16 by then, announced that she wanted to study medicine and become a doctor. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the 1880s, but Yates and Vera never doubted she could achieve it. They started saving money to send her to a college back east, where she might get the education she needed. Peter at 14 was still figuring out his path, but he showed an aptitude for working with wood and metal that suggested a future as a craftsman. Yates encouraged all of it, proud of each of his children's unique talents and dreams. This was what he and Vera had worked for, not just their own security, but the opportunity to give their children choices and futures that were bright with possibility. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates took Vera back to the spot where the original well still stood. They'd built a small covering over it years ago to protect the water source, but the location remained the same. They stood there hand in hand, older now, their faces marked by 2 decades of sun and wind and hard work, but still recognizably the people who'd met in this exact spot all those years ago. 20 years, Vera said softly. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. It's been a good life, Yates said. Better than I ever imagined possible. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Vera asked. When I asked you why you were helping me. I said because you needed it, Yates replied, and because nobody should be out here alone trying to dig a well with their bare hands. I was so angry at you for showing up, Vera said with a laugh, so determined to prove I didn't need anyone. And then you just quietly started digging, and I realized I didn't have to do everything alone. That accepting help didn't make me weak. You were never weak, Yates said firmly. You were the strongest person I'd ever met. Still are. Vera turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. We built something good here, she said. Something that will last beyond us. Our children will build on this foundation, and maybe their children after them, all because you stopped to help a stubborn woman dig a well. All because a stubborn woman refused to give up on her dreams, Yates corrected. I just had the sense to recognize someone worth fighting for. They kissed there by the well, a gentle affirmation of 20 years of partnership and love. Around them, the homestead they'd built together stretched out in all directions, prosperous and alive. The mountains rose in the distance, the same mountains that had witnessed their beginning, and Yates thought about all the years still ahead of them. More challenges, certainly, but also more triumphs. More days of hard work, but also more evenings of satisfaction. More of everything that made life worth living. As they walked back to the house, Yates looked at the land that had become his home, at the woman who walked beside him, and felt the deep contentment of a man who'd found his place in the world. The story of how they'd met would become family legend, passed down through generations, the tale of a cowboy who'd found a woman digging a well with her bare hands, and how he'd grabbed a shovel and dug down with her, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that built an empire of sorts, modest but enduring. The following years brought new challenges and changes. Thomas married a girl from Montrose named Sarah, and they started building their own family on the adjacent homestead. Caroline left for college back in Pennsylvania, writing long letters home about her studies and the strange new world of the eastern cities. Peter apprenticed with a blacksmith in Montrose and showed real talent for the craft, eventually opening his own small workshop. Yates and Vera became grandparents when Thomas and Sarah had their first child, a girl they named Vera after her grandmother. Holding his tiny granddaughter, Yates felt the circle of life completing in a way that was both poignant and joyful. This was legacy, he realized. This was what they'd been building all along, not just land and livestock, but a family that would carry forward the values they held dear. As they aged, Yates and Vera gradually handed over more of the day-to-day operations of the homestead to Thomas and his family. It wasn't retirement exactly, they were both too active for that, but a gradual stepping back, a recognition that the next generation was ready to take the reins. They spent their time on smaller projects, maintaining the house and gardens, helping with the grandchildren, and enjoying the slower pace that came with their 60s. One autumn evening, 35 years after they'd first met, Yates and Vera sat on their porch watching the sunset. The house had been expanded and improved over the decades, the porch now a spacious wrap around a fair with comfortable chairs and a view of the entire property. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, supervised by Sarah, while Thomas worked in the barn. I've been thinking about that well lately, Vera said, her voice contemplative. The one we dug together. What about it? Yates asked. About how it saved my life, really, Vera said. If you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't helped me, I don't think I would have survived that summer. I was so close to the edge, so exhausted and desperate. That well represented everything's survival, hope, the possibility of a future. And you gave me that. We gave it to each other, Yates said, taking her hand. Her fingers were gnarled with arthritis now, the same as his, but they still fit together perfectly. I was drifting before I met you, Vera. Going through the motions of life, but not really living. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to put down roots. That well saved both of us. Vera smiled, that same fierce, bright smile that had captured his heart all those years ago. We should mark it somehow, she said. Make sure future generations know what that spot means. It's where our family began. They worked together over the following weeks to create a small monument at the well site. Thomas helped them quarry and shape stone, while Peter forged a metal plaque that told the story in simple words. Here in August 1883, Yates Sullivan found Vera Owens digging a well with her bare hands. He grabbed a shovel and dug down with her. This well and the partnership it represents became the foundation of the Sullivan family homestead. When they unveiled the monument, the whole family gathered children, grandchildren, in-laws, and friends from throughout the area. Yates stood beside Vera, his arm around her shoulders, and felt the weight of all those years, all those choices, all that love crystallized into this moment. This is why we're here, he said to the assembled crowd, not because of luck or chance, but because someone needed help and someone else was willing to provide it. That's what family is. That's what community is. Seeing what needs to be done and doing it, working together to build something bigger than ourselves. The grandchildren, who ranged from toddlers to teenagers, listened with varying degrees of attention, but Yates hoped the message would sink in over time. These were the values that mattered, the lessons that should be passed down. Hard work, mutual respect, the willingness to help others, the courage to build something new in difficult circumstances. As the sun set that evening and the family dispersed, Yates and Vera lingered at the monument. We did all right, Vera said softly. Didn't we? We did better than all right, Yates replied. We built something real, something that matters. We raised good children who are raising good children of their own. We helped each other and helped others. We loved well. What more could anyone ask? They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a life that exceeded anything they could have imagined. The well that had brought them together still provided water for the homestead, still stood as a testament to what determination and partnership could achieve. Years continued to pass, gentler now, filled with the quiet pleasures of watching grandchildren grow and the homestead flourish under Thomas's capable management. Yates's health began to decline when he was in his early 70s, his body finally rebelling against 7 decades of hard physical labor. Vera nursed him through a difficult winter, her own health still relatively robust, showing the same fierce determination in caring for him that she'd shown in everything else. You're not allowed to leave me yet, she told him one night, when the fever was high and he was drifting. We still have too much living to do. Yates recovered from that illness, but they both knew it was a warning. Their time was finite, the years ahead fewer than the years behind. They talked about death in the frank way of people who'd lived full lives and weren't afraid of what came next. They made sure their affairs were in order, their wishes known, their love declared not just to each other, but to everyone who mattered. When Yates was 76, a heart attack took him quickly one spring morning. He'd been out checking on the cattle with Thomas, had commented on the beauty of the day, and then simply collapsed. By the time Thomas got him back to the house, he was gone. Vera held his body and wept, but there was peace mixed with the grief. They'd had 43 years together, years filled with love and purpose and partnership. It was more than most people ever got. They buried Yates in a small cemetery on the edge of the homestead, near the well that had brought them together. Vera stood at the graveside, supported by her children and grandchildren, and spoke of the man she'd loved. "He was the best person I ever knew," she said simply. "He saw someone in need and helped without question. He built a life with me based on respect and partnership. He was a good husband, a good father, a good man. We were lucky to have him, and he made all of this possible." Vera lived another 8 years after Yates's death, remaining active and sharp almost to the end. She spent her time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories about the old days, about the struggle to establish the homestead, and the man who'd made it all possible. She made sure they understood what Yates had represented, not perfection, but goodness, not ease, but effort, not luck, but the choice to act when action was needed. When Vera finally passed at the age of 84, peaceful in her sleep with family nearby, they buried her beside Yates. The monument at the well became a place where family members would visit, reading the plaque and remembering the story. Children would run their fingers over the words and ask their parents to tell them again about great-great-grandfather Yates and great-great-grandmother Vera, about how he'd found her digging with her bare hands and how he'd grabbed a shovel to help. The homestead itself continued for generations, expanded and modernized, but never abandoned. The original cabin became a kind of shrine, carefully maintained, while newer buildings served the practical needs of modern ranching. The well that Yates and Vera had dug together eventually stopped being used for daily water needs as better systems were installed, but it was never filled in or destroyed. It remained as a reminder, a physical connection to the moment that had started everything. The story passed into family legend, embellished slightly with each retelling, but keeping its essential truth that love could begin with a simple act of kindness, that partnership built on mutual respect could weather any storm, that two people working together could create something that lasted far beyond their own lives. Children grew up hearing about the cowboy who found a woman digging a well with her bare hands, how he grabbed a shovel and dug down with her, and how that moment of connection had blossomed into one of the great love stories of their family. The Sullivan homestead became known throughout the region, not because it was the biggest or richest, but because of what it represented. Visitors would stop to see the well and read the monument, inspired by the simple story of two people who'd refused to give up on their dreams and found each other in the process. The values that Yates and Vera had lived by hard work, mutual support, helping others without expectation of reward became embedded in the family culture, passed down like precious heirlooms. Decades after their deaths, when the American West had been fully settled and the wild frontier days had passed into history, the story of Yates and Vera Sullivan was still told. Historians studying homestead-era Colorado would sometimes mention them as examples of the ordinary people who'd built communities through sheer determination. Romance writers would occasionally reference their story as proof that true love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. But for the Sullivan family, they were simply great-great-grandparents who'd loved each other well and built something that lasted. The well itself, that simple hole in the ground that had required such back-breaking labor, became more than just a source of water. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people worked together, when someone saw a need and acted to fill it, when partnership and love provided the foundation for building a life. The image of Yates finding Vera, digging with her bare hands, of him grabbing a shovel without hesitation, became the defining moment of the family's origin story. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the acres they'd accumulated or the wealth they'd built, but the love they'd shared and the example they'd set. They'd proven that two people from different backgrounds, thrown together by chance and circumstance, could create something beautiful and lasting if they were willing to work for it. They'd shown their children and grandchildren, and all who came after, that the best things in life came from effort and partnership, from seeing what needed to be done and doing it together. The Colorado sun continued to rise and set over the Sullivan homestead. The mountains stood eternal watch, and the well that had brought Yates and Vera together remained as testament to a love that had begun with dirt under fingernails and the simple kindness of a man who couldn't pass by someone in need. It was a story that deserved to be remembered, to be told and retold, because it spoke to the best of human nature, the capacity to help, to love, to build something meaningful in partnership with another person. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, rooted in the moment when a cowboy found a woman digging a well with her bare hands and made the choice that would define both their lives. He grabbed a shovel and dug down with her, and in doing so, dug the foundation for a love story that would endure long after they were both gone, a testament to the power of kindness, partnership, and the courage to build a life together in the wild and beautiful West.